Welcome to the World Bank Praxis discussion series. I'm Oscar Sabakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney and those watching on APAC, online and listening on radio, and everyone watching in Dili, Honiara and Port Moresby. And now we're also being streamed live online. Just visit live.worldbank.org to watch and ask a question, and you can follow the discussion on Twitter using the Pacific Praxis hashtag. Well, as one of the most dispersed regions in the world, the Pacific faces unique challenges in providing affordable and accessible electricity, with a heavy reliance on diesel-fuelled generators to power homes and businesses. Electricity prices in the region are among the highest in the world, with some countries spending as much as a quarter of their gross domestic product on fuel imports. To mitigate this exposure, Pacific governments are increasingly turning to alternative energy sources, including biofuels, wind, solar and hydro systems. As negotiations at the COP21 climate change talks in Paris continue, what actions are being taken in the Pacific to increase the uptake of renewables? Are new technologies even worth investing in? And what role should development partners play? Well, joining us to discuss these issues and more are Kamleshwar Kalawan, Senior Energy Specialist at the World Bank here in Sydney, Paul Fulton, Manager of the Dual Logic in Hobart, Andrew Ducker, Executive Director of the Pacific Power Association in Suva, and Matthew Dornan, Research Fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra. Thank you all for joining us today. Well, firstly, I thought I'd ask you to paint us a picture. Matthew, if I could start with you. In your role at the Australian National University, your research has been drawn on widely in terms of renewable energy in the Pacific. Can you just give us a description of what energy is being used and where exactly?
Well, I guess overall the Pacific remains very reliant on fossil fuels. So most Pacific Island countries rely almost exclusively on diesel generators, on oil-fired generation for their electricity supply. There are some exceptions, Fiji for example, Samoa, PNG, but certainly for most of the Pacific that statement is true. The issue in the Pacific is that these countries don't produce fossil fuels. As a result, all fossil fuels are imported in the region. Fossil-fueled power generation tends to be expensive, and of course it exposes Pacific Island countries to oil price volatility.
And Cam, as we've seen, energy access rates are quite low relative to the rest of the world. Now, why is this, and how can renewable energy be the answer to this?
I think in the Pacific, one of the reasons why energy access is so low is because of the weak capacity in the government, both in terms of planning and implementation of programs. The other reason is that the Pacific Islands are generally dispersed, small islands in small load centers. The economies of scale do not exist, so it's very difficult to get out there and get energy available to the communities in the Pacific. As an example, I mean, the land mass in the Pacific is about the size of New Zealand, and that's spread over 15% of the world's total area. So it is quite a challenge to get energy out there. And finally, I think the main challenge for the governments is that they need access to finance. And I think taking all that into account and the type of solutions that can work for these remote dispersed communities is renewable energy. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for renewable energy to be deployed in these smaller load centers and to increase access levels for these communities.
Andrew, you're from one of the Pacific's largest bodies representing energy suppliers in the region. Is there a push among the utility companies to develop renewable energy, and why is there this push?
The Pacific Island utilities that are members of my organization are 80% owned by the national governments. The national governments have recognized the need to accelerate the integration of renewable energy and increase the capacity in renewable energy. Mostly for purposes of lessening the impacts of fuel price fluctuations impacting on the islands. There is a lot of push now within the Pacific Island countries to do so, and it's one of the reasons why the Pacific have engaged development partners and other organizations in developing renewable energy programs for the Pacific Island countries, mainly to be able to lessen the impact of fuel price fluctuations. And the climate change benefits are and the actions that the governments are taking are as a symbolic gesture from the Pacific Island countries in being able to do something, although they do not emit the high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, but being able to say we are impacted by these climate change changes, and although we are not emitting that much, this is what we can do in terms of renewable energy, and renewable energy does that for the Pacific Island countries.
So that's interesting, because I think many of us would associate renewable energy sources as a way to address climate change issues, but in the case of Pacific Island nations, it's more a necessity. So you're saying that there's a focus on renewables to avoid price hikes and price volatility.
Yes, and then based on experience and the events of 2008 in some of the Pacific Island countries, where they've had to declare a state of emergencies because they do not have the resources to be able to buy fuel for diesel generation, just simply because of the fact that the price was no longer affordable. So it's more to be able to have that in place rather than the climate change issues.
So more stability and sustainable access to power.
Yes.
Okay, Paul, if I could now turn to you. You're an independent power producer in the Pacific. Can you first tell us what sort of, what structures do you have in place in the Pacific and why you entered it?
Oscar, I am an independent power producer. We don't actually have any facilities operating in the Pacific at the moment. Some of the key barriers for IPPs, independent power producers in the Pacific, are that renewable projects are typically highly capital intensive, and there's a lot of fluctuation associated with the price of diesel, so what they're competing against. So to get the certainty for an investor to come into the Pacific, they really need, we've all heard the term feed-in tariffs, or some stability associated with and certainty associated with the price that they will achieve for the energy that they export to the grid. They also need some certainty on being able to dispatch the energy that is generated by the device, whether it's solar or wind or other renewable energy sources such as biomass, into the network. With small networks, quite often there are constraints on generation when the load and the generation are out of balance. So there are key things, key risks associated with for an IPP that make it that can be overcome, but the structures are quite often not there to enable that high capital investment in renewable energy systems.
And we'll take a closer look at the obstacles and the solutions, but before we do, have those obstacles prevented you from entering the market?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Excellent. All right, let's move on now. If we look at this concept of renewable energy targets, because many nations in the Pacific have them in place. Samoa has quite an ambitious one, that they want to go 100% renewable by 2017, so in a couple of years' time. Matthew, from your research, are targets like Samoa's realistically achievable, and What is the current rate of renewable energy uptake?
It's hard to answer that for the Pacific as a whole. The answer really depends on the country which you're considering. In some cases, Fiji, for example, high targets are absolutely appropriate. Fiji has a wide range of renewable energy resources that can be developed at low cost and can provide electricity at a cost below the alternative, which is diesel generators or oil-fired generation. That said, there are also very ambitious targets in countries like Tuvalu, like Nauru, which don't have those low-cost renewable energy resources. So in those cases, I think achieving the targets that they've set will be much more difficult, will be much more costly, will certainly depend on development finance. And really, I think that those targets are set at the political level. They're set due to concerns about climate change, which small island nations quite understandably are concerned about. And those targets, I guess, bolster the position of those countries in climate change negotiations.
So, Andrew, given the fact that, as Matthew says, a lot of these nations have quite ambitious targets, whether or not they're set realistically or politically, I guess, is another side issue. But given that these targets exist anyway, how committed are energy producers in trying to achieve those renewable energy targets?
In terms of the targets, I think some of the countries will find it quite difficult to meet the targets. As Matthew has mentioned, the options in terms of the renewable energy resources are very limited, especially in the smaller, low-lying countries in the Pacific. For the bigger countries that have a number of resources available that can be achieved. Although what we're seeing is some of the countries resetting their targets because now there is a lot more work done in terms of identifying the resources and how that can be, and the various actions that can be taken to achieve the targets. We have seen a number of countries now resetting the targets so that it becomes more achievable for their country in terms of the renewable energy generation.
So in terms of developing renewable energy sources in these countries, do you believe that it should be the government that does this, or the private sector, or a combination?
I think it's going to be everybody. The customers, as one of the stakeholders, they can do their part in terms of not only taking part in renewable energy generation, but also being conscious of the consumption and embarking on energy efficiency initiatives. The private sector plays a very important role in getting towards working towards the targets. And this is an area where a lot of the Pacific Island countries still need a lot of work to be done in terms of the regulatory frameworks and the policies that can enable private sector to participate in renewable energy generation. Remembering that a lot of the utilities, at least in 80% of the utilities in the Pacific, who are members of my organizations, are owned by the governments, and the utilities were set up using government legislations that set their roles and the responsibilities in terms of electricity supply.
Okay, so Paul, as Andrew mentioned, he believes that you need a government and a private sector approach to it all, but you're saying that there are many obstacles in place that prevent potential suppliers like yourself from entering the Pacific energy market. What can be done, in your view, to encourage people like yourself to develop energy in the region?
Well, the targets are very, very important to have an overriding policy position for targets. So that aligns everybody right up front, that the whole idea is to move forwards and to reduce the use of diesel predominantly. So that's extremely important. However, electricity systems evolve, and it's very hard to make a policy setting such as a feed-in tariff or
Just briefly explain to us what a feed-in tariff
okay,
is.
a feed-in tariff is just a price that the energy utility or the government guarantees that they will pay for a certain volume of electricity, a certain number of kilowatt hours. It takes a brave person to actually say, okay, you can have X dollars or X cents per kilowatt hour, which is the energy unit, for the next 15 years. In the situation where you've got huge price volatility of diesel generation, or also the price of solar panels is coming down dramatically, when's the right time to go, yes, we'll give that certain price to an independent power producer? So that mechanism is very difficult to do. So although policy is very, very important, I think it also there's a role there for the people to be running the power systems to be empowered to make that decision for themselves, where they say, okay, this price that I'm striking today and these terms and conditions of the contract with the independent power producer, I am happy with that, even if the situation arises in 3 years' time where I might be able to get a lower price of energy from a new independent power producer. Someone has to be able to make the decision to strike that contract. That's important.
So you're looking for certainty basically before you invest?
Well, I'm looking for not necessarily certainty. Certainty is nothing's certain. There are all sorts of risks. There are environmental risks, sovereign risk, technology risks. So there's nothing certain, but there has to be the uncertainty has to be able to be quantified. So you know what the downsides are to making an investment. The situation for an independent power producer can't be if they go in and they spend a lot of capital, and then 3 years down the track, technology has improved, and whoever the utility, their counterparty for the contracts, can get a cheaper source of electricity, then they can have a stranded asset there, which is extremely expensive. And if a few situations like that occur, then it doesn't do the industry any favours throughout the whole of the Pacific.
Okay, so Cam, we've heard about the role of government and the private sector in developing renewables in the region, but what role do development organisations have to play in all this?
Yeah, we are doing a lot of things on several fronts. One of the things is, as I mentioned, to address the weak planning and implementation capacity. We are assisting client governments with support in terms of building their own capacity, undertaking resource studies. We are also investing in renewable energy technology to build the confidence and build the capacity of the government and the operators of those facilities. We are working with the donors and other development partners to mobilize finance. We can work with the governments to address the issue that Paul raised in terms of creating the regulatory environment to create certainty for the private sector to go and invest in the energy sector. I mean, the amount of capital that is required to meet the energy challenges of the Pacific Island countries is enormous. So it has to be a combination of the government, the private sector, and the development partners to fund those investments. And I think one of the critical factors is to get the enabling framework for the private sector to be able to participate. We also provide grants where required for the investments or concessional loans or no interest loans. We have facilities where we can provide guarantees for private sector to participate in these countries, both in terms of guarantees for the credit, for the loans, and also guaranteeing the PPAs. And the bank also has a facility to assist with dispute resolution should the government or the private sector or any other stakeholder have issues with resolving disputes in our client countries.
Okay, so it sounds like renewable energy sources are really the only way to go for many of these Pacific Island nations who don't have access to, say, gas deposits or oil deposits. So really these countries need to make it work. So before we move on to questions, can I just ask each of you, do you believe the development of these energy sources in the Pacific is on the right track? Is it moving forward?
I'll go first. Yeah, I think there has been tremendous progress over the last decade or so. There's greater acceptance of renewable energy technologies, particularly among power utilities in the region. I think there's also been regulatory reform to try to address some of those challenges that my other panel members have alluded to. I do have some concerns, however. I think that in all of this, energy efficiency hasn't been given sufficient attention. Generally, avoided cost of generation is lower than the cost of generation from renewable energy technologies. So this is where the greatest economic gains can be made. And so I think there's room to move in the energy efficiency space, and that is happening, but I think it has taken some time to develop. My other concern would be access to electricity. So we live in a region where 70% of Pacific Islanders don't have access to an electricity supply, and renewable energy can play an important role in expanding access to electricity. However, I think often the focus of both governments and of investors has been on providing power to existing electricity networks, and that obviously excludes a large portion of Pacific Islanders.
Andrew?
Yes, I think there's been a lot of progress made in the last 10, 15 years. As Matthew has mentioned, there's been an acceptance of renewable energy and the private sector participation from within the utilities, and the progress we've seen has resulted in the size of the installations, especially in solar installations, going from kilowatt size to megawatt size. So there's been a lot of progress made in terms of renewable energy, especially in solar. I think for the utilities, it's more, I think their concern would be being able to take that additional generation on board, but not have adverse impacts on the system performance. That is important for the network operator, but it can be addressed through current technology and technology that's being researched. So I think there is good progress, and it can be done.
Paul?
Well, I think that the last 10 years or so have been very, very exciting, and that has been driven by technological change, specifically the cost of solar energy, solar photovoltaic panels dropping dramatically. That's causing quite a revolution. It's clearly the case now that solar is much, much cheaper than diesel-fired generation. Even that's still the case, even though recently diesel prices have dropped dramatically. So that there's clearly an acceptance of renewable energy right throughout the Pacific. The question is now how to maximise, get the most renewable energy there. And there are plenty of technologies that are evolving now that we'll see it become very, very commonplace, driven by different requirements. So electric vehicles are bringing the cost of battery systems down. There are also wind turbines now that are capable of being deployed in cyclonic areas. There are diesel systems that are specifically designed for high penetration renewable energy, intermittent energy sources. So the diesel systems, which form the backbone of all these generation systems, are now technologically more suitable for accepting the variation of wind and solar energy. So that there are exciting times ahead over the next 10 years, and I think the pace of change will actually ramp up and the benefits will increase more over the next 10 years than they have over the previous 10.
Okay, Cam, are you as optimistic?
I'm very optimistic in terms of where renewable energy is going in the Pacific. The cost of solar PV in particular is falling. Wind is competitive. In the Pacific Islands, only 2 countries have their indigenous fossil fuel resources. A couple have hydro resources, which is
Sorry,
used.
which nations are they?
Timor-Leste and PNG have fossil fuels. PNG, Solomons, Vanuatu, PNG, Solomons and Fiji have hydro resources. And there's some also potential geothermal power available in PNG, Solomons, Vanuatu, and possibly Fiji as well. So most of the countries in the Pacific, other than the ones who have hydro, rely on imported diesel fuel. Diesel fuel in the city areas is reasonably well priced. It's not that expensive, but in the outer areas, the prices are exorbitant. So for the outer islands, the only solutions are more or less renewable energy, and they are very competitive. Even in the larger islands, in the load center, where the load centers are bigger, grid-connected solar is very competitive with diesel fuel as well. So the future of renewable energy, I think, is in the Pacific is enormous. And I think if we are going to achieve the access rates that these governments are targeting, we will have to think about different models of meeting this demand, especially in sparsely populated small load centers. And we have some programs already underway that are addressing some of these challenges.
Okay, well, it sounds like there's quite a positive outlook from each of you here, despite the many obstacles. At this point, let's move on to question time. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please raise your hand. We've got questions coming in from overseas now. I might start with a question from Papua New Guinea. This one's directed at the panel. What type of renewable energy would be best suited to a country like PNG? And Cam, you mentioned that PNG was one of the few countries that have a fossil fuel source. So this person's asking, what type of renewable energy would suit PNG?
We are doing some resource mapping in PNG at the moment. Hydro potential is quite significant in PNG, and I think depending on what the cost structure works out eventually, that would be a significant potential for PNG, especially given the land mass and the size of population that currently does not have electricity.
Okay. Do you agree? Is that one solution for PNG?
I think PNG is much more well-resourced in terms of renewable energy resources than the Pacific, rest of the Pacific Island countries. So I think for PNG, it's a case of identifying what's the best option for them, because they do have, like Kamala just mentioned, hydro. There's geothermal, not only potential, but it's already being exploited now. And then you have solar and wind. So PNG has, in terms of renewable energy resources, more options than, like I mentioned earlier, the lower lying coral countries in the Pacific region.
I think PNG's asking for a specific technology or that's appropriate for PNG is a difficult question, because what I believe is that there are different technologies that are suitable for the coastal areas of PNG versus the highlands, remote areas versus areas that have strong interconnected distribution systems, electrical distribution systems. So the key thing is to enable whoever in government or in the power authority, to enable them to be able to make the decision to implement a project that is beneficial for the community at any level. So if it's appropriate that a small hydro goes ahead on a network interconnected system and it's really cost effective and evident that that project benefits the community, then there should be a policy or an empowerment of the people to make the decision associated with that project. So that's the key thing. We should be technology agnostic and pick the right technology for the right solution. And these are all proven technologies. Solar is proven, wind is proven. It's not the technology that's the issue here in most cases. It's having the people that feel empowered to make the decision, whether that can be achieved from a policy point of view. I'd have to leave it to others in the panel to move forwards with.
Okay, well let's move on to a question from Sydney if we have one. Yes, ma'am? Oh, sir?
I guess this is mainly directed at Paul and Matthew. How much impact do you think the current oil glut and the consequent low prices are having on the installation of renewable facilities? And do you think that with the diversity of renewable facilities which are suitable in the Pacific area, that the frequency of extreme weather events brought about by climate change are going to have a higher impact in terms of the damage to these facilities as against centralised diesel generation?
I'll start with the oil glut question. So I think it has had some impact. I think a lot of Pacific Island governments were motivated to, encourage or facilitate the installation of renewable energy when oil prices were high. So back in 2007, 2008, that's really where renewable energy came to the fore. Obviously, it takes a number of years to actually install those systems, to make the appropriate regulatory reforms and so forth. And what we're now finding in some countries where renewable energy systems have been installed, prices haven't necessarily dropped, and people are asking, well, why hasn't that occurred? I think it's really important to distinguish between the price impact of an investment and the risk impact of an investment. So a big reason for favouring renewable energy installation as opposed to just putting in a diesel generator is that it reduces that exposure to oil price volatility. Yes, oil prices are low now. In another 10 years, they'll probably be high again. That's the nature of oil prices. So investments in renewables should be understood, I guess, as a risk mitigation mechanism rather than as a guarantee of low prices.
I think Andrew's probably a better place to answer that question than me, but I get the feeling that there's a collective memory in the Pacific associated with April 2008 when oil prices were triple what they are now. And I think that people learnt a very hard lesson there about their vulnerability to high oil prices. So the incentives to displace oil are very, very much at the forefront of most people's memories and minds. In relation to your question about climate change, I think that there is talking about the Pacific, which, as we heard earlier, covers 15% of the planet. It depends which island or which nation you're talking about. Some are cyclonic, some aren't. But if you're talking about sort of cyclonic events, then those cyclonic events have happened over a very long time, have always been there. If climate change increases the severity of those, then that could be problematic to the long-term investment of renewables that get damaged by those events. Although they are very, very they are quite resilient to those events.
Okay, I've got a question from Solomon Islands for Andrew. So, renewable energy requires technical capacity. What areas of training would you recommend young Pacific Islanders take in terms of qualifications?
I think for renewable energy, there has been always training, technical training, but there are other aspects to renewable energy that I think we see the need to undertake for different groups. We see the need, for example, in terms of the policy training in renewable energy. We need these people to be able to develop renewable energy policies and directions that countries need to take on board. Technical training has always been in the field of the utilities, and that continues to change as technology changes, and also in terms of the financial aspects of being able to determine what is good and what will work and what will not work for a particular country in terms of renewable energy training. And it's encouraging to note that there is that recognition by development partners now, and they're putting resources into developing that training within the Pacific through the European Union funded PAC-TVAT, also World Bank funding to various organizations and other development partners who are not only addressing the technical aspects, but the whole range of skills that is required in terms of pushing the renewable energy agenda forward.
Okay, excellent. Let's go to the question from Sydney.
I'm Laura from Global Voices, and I had a question probably directed to Paul. You talked about needing to be technologically agnostic across this diverse area. I just have a question regarding wave energy for some of the smaller nations. I know it's really new technology even in Australia, but is there a potential that could be harnessed for obviously the nations that have smaller land mass and potential with oceans there?
Thanks for that question, Laura. There's no doubt there's a lot of energy in waves. However, on a global scale, there aren't a lot of successful commercial wave energy operations occurring. I think that technology, even though it's been investigated since the 1960s, is still nascent, with very early technology, and I think we have to be careful using early technologies in remote areas, because I just get the feeling that we don't really want to turn the Pacific into a test bed for these technologies. I think it's better to have a test bed for these technologies that are closer to where they're being developed. However, keeping that in mind, a lot of people were very, very cynical about solar and were very cynical about wind. And I think that we need to be open-minded about these things, but also fully cognizant of the fact that they are very early technology things.
If I can just add, I think in the Pacific we have seen a number of these cases where new technology has been promoted, technology that still hasn't matured, and I think in the Pacific we do not have the resources to be able to operate, maintain, and manage these new technologies. It is if it's unproven technology, and as we've seen in the early stages of solar, we've had a lot of failed projects in the Pacific. We learn from it, but it's an expensive learning exercise. In terms of the Pacific situation, we would look at technology that has matured, is proven, and so that we have the confidence to be able to operate and maintain. We have seen instances where new technology has been floated, but I think it was used for other purposes rather than the intention that we've been sold.
So let's get it working off the coast of Perth first, or off the coast of Port Kembla, and let's make sure it doesn't sink when it gets towed out to where it's supposed to be moored. We're probably, quite a few of us are probably aware of many issues associated with wave energy devices in the past. Let's just get it working well before we put it into a highly corrosive, difficult to maintain situation which is exposed to large extreme events in the sea off the coast of many small Pacific islands. I think that's probably the main. We're in agreement about wave energy.
So erring on the side of caution. Excellent. And now we've got a question from Papua New Guinea. Cam, if I can get you to answer this one. Is there anything that we as individuals can do to increase renewable energy usage? And I want to put this question to you because you were describing to me some interesting projects that households were doing individually rather than electricity suppliers working on a grid.
Yeah, I think the project I referred to was to meet a special need. I mean, we were looking at remote communities in Vanuatu. And the issues there are that there is no technical know-how in these communities. So if you put out technologies that require technicians to install or fix it, it's not going to work for very long. It's going to fall apart and it'll go into disrepair. So what we've done is we've targeted plug-and-play systems to be deployed by the private sector to the rural communities where the only thing the householders have to do is change the batteries when they need to be changed. So we are trying to meet a need, taking into account the specific situations of those communities. In terms of what individuals can do to sort of promote renewable energy, I think the first point would be, I think I'd go to one of the comments made earlier, is that individuals can use their energy more efficiently. So it's not directly promoting renewable energy, but it's taking the burden off any fossil fuel-based generation or any sort of generation of electricity. On the other hand, I think individuals can also become more aware of little things they can do to improve the way they use their energy. From an investment perspective, I think people should consider what's the ideal solution for them in terms of using energy. A lot of rural communities probably only need, at this stage, energy for lighting, perhaps for phone charging, so they can look for solutions that meet their immediate needs and then wait for the bigger developments to come along to give them more horsepower in terms of what they can do with electricity.
Excellent. Do we have another question from Sydney? So.
Oh, thanks. Oh.
It's Tom McTeer from Siemens. I'm just interested in terms of the business models for these plants. Are there any particular models that have more sort of buy-in than others, that are more successful based on what has been done? For example, an IPP or an owner investment, build, own, operate, transfer. What sort of appetite is there for these various business models? Yeah.
Who would like to answer that? Cam, do you want to answer?
I mean, in the islands, most power generation systems, if they're grid-based systems, are operated by either the government or state-owned enterprises. Vanuatu is one of the countries where private concession holders operate the grid. But I think we are talking about expanding access. So we need to look for solutions where we're talking about small grid systems, where IPPs, build on operate type models would be much better. We don't know how attractive these will be to private investors to build, own and operate. What we know though is that if the government or the community owns and operates it, they don't work very effectively because the communities do not have the technical know-how or the commercial know-how to run a power system. So we are just embarking on a couple of programs where we're trying to get the private sector to operate it. And we're looking to cover the viability gap to make it attractive to IPP type arrangements, build, own, operate, or even the government owns it and the operators are private sector under management contracts.
Okay, we've got a question here from the World Bank live stream, and it's from UTS here in Sydney. Are there countries that are getting the policy conditions right? How have they overcome risks around comparable oil price volatility? So, can I put that question to you, Matthew? Are there countries that are getting it right in terms of the policy framework?
I guess I'd say there's great variation between the policy framework of different Pacific Island countries. Some countries are far ahead of others. Even countries that are way ahead, a country like Fiji, for example, I think still face issues around the attraction of IPPs. So Fiji has established, over the last 10 years, has established a good independent regulator which sets prices for feed-in tariffs. So for the payment to independent power producers for actually supplying the grid. Even there, though, Fiji has had real trouble in attracting an independent power producer to produce in the country. There are a range of issues, lack of clarity around dispatch, for example, whether when power is no longer required, whether the independent power producer will be the first to go offline and therefore lose that revenue. So it is a very complicated space. I don't think any country can claim to have it completely right, and certainly in Australia we don't have it right, but there has been progress made, and I think that there's enormous progress that could be made in countries where there still hasn't been a great deal of reform, particularly the smaller island nations, which are effectively operating government-owned utilities and have done very little to attract private sector investment.
So what about outside the Pacific? Is there a country that's navigated this area well, in your view?
I mean, I guess the history of power sector reform goes back to the 80s. Countries that are frequently highlighted as best practice, the UK and Chile. Even in those cases, however, there were real issues with the power sector reforms that took place. In both cases, there were improvements in efficiency, reductions in the cost of power that was generated, but then due to inadequate regulation, those cost savings didn't flow to the end user. So even in countries where there has been great advances, that there are still issues.
Okay, do we have another question in Sydney? Ma'am, yep.
Hi, Shonda Phillips from Sydney Uni. I guess this question's for both Andrew or Matthew. I'm just wondering how the renewable energy sources in Fiji sit in with your agricultural production systems there. So I think you've mostly got hydro and some biomass as well. I wonder, how you go in terms of competing for resources for ag production.
I think in Fiji, in terms of the agricultural resources, they do have Fiji Sugar Corporation, which sells to the grid during the crushing season, as well as Tropic Woods, which does wood chip, and then sells to the Fiji Electricity Corporation as well. So those are the two that I'm aware of. But there is currently a work underway on a biomass plant, which is looking at 20 megawatts. So it is going to contribute significantly to the generation mix in Fiji. And I think there is potential for more, with Fiji being having a lot more options in terms of in terms of renewable energy resources within the Fiji group, not only on VT level but also in Vanuatu level as well.
Those are also the examples that I'm aware of. The Fiji economy is often compared to the economy of Mauritius. and Mauritius has been very successful. And I think this is an area where Mauritius also has been quite successful. That's in cogeneration from the sugar milling industry. So one of the issues that the Fiji Sugar Corporation faces is that it has these plants, but they often don't produce. So when sugar isn't being processed, they're not producing power. In Mauritius, they actually import coal, and they use that in the off-season. So it's not a renewable energy resource, obviously, and it can be criticised on environmental grounds. But that, from a financial perspective, is the most efficient option. So I agree with Paul's earlier comment about needing to remain technology agnostic. I think it's really important to weigh your options on a case-by-case basis.
Do we have another question from Sydney? So.
Kirk Huffman, I have links with the museum in Tahiti and the museum in Vanuatu, Australian Museum, Sydney Uni and the University of Nantes in France. Going back to part of Michael Hefner's question at the end here, he was talking about climate change and stronger cyclones and more stronger natural disaster events and stuff. And Paul had given a partial answer on that. But earlier this year we had Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu with winds of up to 420 kilometers an hour at one point. Now that's beyond the scale. That's above a level 5. There are actually officially no levels above a 5, but that's actually a level 6. What happened was the Digicel mobile phone telephone network throughout the whole country broke down. Almost the whole country was silent for a while, for 3 or 4 or 5 days or so. It turns out that it looks as if all their towers had only been built very rapidly, very well, but only to withstand a level 3 cyclone. What we found was that trying to communicate with people in the outer islands after that was almost impossible for up to as much as 2 months after the cyclone in some more remote areas. But we finally managed to get through to them, not on the new Digicel network, but the old-fashioned government network, where the towers had been built much more expensively and very slowly, but were built like concrete bunkhouses. And they were still working. But because everybody had been sort of persuaded by Digicel is the way to go, okay, Digicel is okay. I think the UN Green Fund, or whatever it has, been given to the World Bank to distribute for climate change adaptation. How about if the World Bank gave out, not as loans, but as gifts, the money from that giant basket full of billions of dollars to Pacific Island nations who might want to build, for example, cyclone-proof mobile phone networks? After studying the situation in Vanuatu, it'd be worthwhile thinking about. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
More of a statement than a question. Okay, thank you. So,
Basically, I'm saying, could the World Bank help out on that? Give Digicel some money to build strong towers or something, whatever.
You'd like to answer? Sure.
I think Vanuatu was a good example, actually. There's also a good example of building resilience in the way the renewable energy installations are built. The wind turbines in Vanuatu can be taken down. So during the cyclone period, they were basically pulled down to the ground to protect them from the wind. And so far as funding organizations to build resilience, I mean, all the projects that development banks like ourselves, IDB and others do is we carefully consider including building resilience into all the projects we do. So we take considerations of natural disasters and other factors into account when the projects are being designed. So that money you talked about and other funds would flow towards making sure that whatever we put up doesn't fall down in cyclones, or at least are resilient to some extent.
Okay, we're almost coming to a close, but we have a question here from Solomon Islands from the Hautonga Group. Given the location of PNG and their LNG, should we be looking towards LNG as an alternate energy source in the Pacific? So clearly not a renewable energy source, but one that's quite abundant in that region. Should that be considered as being distributed more widely?
That is an interesting question, and one which the World Bank, together with the Pacific Power Association and SPC, have explored through a study that is with the report to be released soon. Looking at what other options do we have in terms of energy for electricity generation. And although LNG is not renewable, it's much cleaner than diesel. And I think whether we can access from PNG is something that PNG and the developers can only they can answer that question. But if it's a resource that's available readily, cheaply to the Pacific Islands, I'm sure the bigger utilities would certainly look at that, and it is also something that the utilities themselves are looking at, just to look at what other electricity generation options they have in terms of fuel.
Interesting. And we have time for just one more question from Sydney. If there's a lucky last one. Ma'am, yep. Oh, sorry, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone.
Hi, Chloe Hicks from the New South Wales Government. I have a question, and it could be for anyone on the panel. What role do you see energy storage and particularly battery technologies playing in sort of enabling renewable energy in the Pacific?
Yes, the storage issue that is that much of the world is grappling with in terms of renewable energy.
I think for the Pacific Islands it would be a major game changer. I think not only for the Pacific Islands but for all the electric utilities as well. For the Pacific Islands it will bring them closer to being able to achieve that 100% renewable energy target. For the electricity utilities it is a whole new ball game altogether, because they will have to change the way they see customers, whether are they customers or are they generation source. So it's going to be going to have quite a significant impact on energy, electricity as a whole. Yeah.
I see it as a game changer. It's especially for customers. Customers on networks at the moment they might install a certain amount of solar, for instance, and they'll only install the amount of solar that meets their maximum demand, or the maximum magnitude of energy that they're using, because they don't want to export it. Quite often in the Pacific Islands they don't get compensated for the energy that they export to the network. As soon as there is a cost-effective storage system, that situation will change, and it might enable them to put in 3 or 4 times as much solar as they do at the moment. And when that starts to happen, it'll make the networks more difficult to operate cost effectively, because they won't be selling enough volume down their networks, they won't get compensated for the network. So there has to be, it's going to require, in Australia or in the Pacific Islands, it's going to require, or any other country in fact, if storage becomes cheap, it's going to require different policy and different methodologies for recovering costs to enable the shared assets that people who are connected to a distribution system, the poles and wires, they have to be paid for by somebody. So storage could actually be problematic for the networks. But great news for renewable energy.
Would either of you like to add to that, the issue of storage?
Yeah, I think for the Pacific Islands, this storage is a necessity. Solar energy is intermittent. You only have it during the day. So if you want to use it at any other time, you need to store it. Also, I think as the panelists have alluded to, there is a limit to how much intermittent generation you can put into a grid. If you have storage, you can increase the amount of renewable energy that you can also put into the grid as well. So hopefully, with the cost going down, it will become a game changer, as the panelists are saying, for the Pacific.
And I'd just add, I think, as Paul has said, it would be a game changer for utilities. But I think what makes the Pacific unique to many other parts of the world is that in parts of Europe, for example, where you have very high levels of wind energy penetration, when the wind stops blowing, they can actually import electricity from other countries, and that occurs on a regular basis. In the Pacific, you can't have that, and that means that those 100% renewable energy targets are much more costly to achieve because you have to invest in storage, which currently is very expensive. So when the price of storage drops, it will be a real game changer for the region.
One more.
Sure.
Batteries also, even in a pure diesel system, can add flexibility to the network. They can. I've been told not to get too technical, but what they can do is they can change the way that a diesel, the number of diesel engines are bought online. So you don't have to have reserve capacity for large changes in the load on the system. So batteries can really help with efficiencies on the network. It all comes down to the cost of those batteries, and at the moment those battery costs are still too high. They're just it's not yet cost effective without donor funds, for instance.
To watch this space.
To watch this space. That's great. And of course we've probably all heard about Tesla and Panasonic and Samsung. They're all putting in massive battery factories. BYD is another one. So there's a real revolution going on in the battery space at the moment.
Excellent. Well, on that note, that brings us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our panellists, Kamleshwar Kelawan, Paul Fulton, Andrew Ducker and Matthew Dornan. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of the other Praxis discussions at worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Oscar Sabakti. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now. Well done. That's a good discussion.